Alison Ware's The Princes in the Tower, Chapter 13, also entitled The Princes in the Tower. Richard III learned of the sanctuary plot before the 29th of July. On that day, or shortly afterwards, he arrived with his train at Gloucester. More says that on his way there he devised as he rode to fulfill that thing which he before had intended, for his mind gave him that his nephews, living men, would not reckon that he could have right to the realm. He thought, therefore, without delay, to rid them, as though the killing of his kinsman could amend his cause and make him kindly king. It was an opportune time to act. The magnates had left London. He himself was nowhere near the king, and hopefully beyond suspicion. And the initial alarm over his usurpation seemed to have died down. Moore and Virgil say that when Richard arrived at Gloucester, he sent for a man called John Green, whom he specially trusted. John Green can be traced. He had been employed in various capacities by Richard when he was Duke of Gloucester, and by Sir James Tyrrell, Richard's faithful retainer. He may well have been the same John Green who is recorded in the calendar of patent rolls for 1474 to 1475 as working in Edward IV's household. On the 30th of July, 1483, John Green signed a warrant appointing one John Gregory to take hay oats, horse bread, beans, peas, and litter for all the expenses of the king's horses and litters for a period of 6 months. The king says, Moore sent Green unto Sir Robert Brackenbury, constable of the Tower, with a letter and credence that the same Sir Robert should in anywise put the 2 children to death. It has been argued that Richard III would never have committed such an order to paper, but it is nevertheless plausible that he did so. His letter, like the one he sent from Minster Lovel, is likely to have been discreetly worded so as not to compromise himself. Green was to supply the credence, the unwritten, explicit details to Brackenbury, and both were men trusted implicitly by Richard. Continues Moore. This John Green did his errand unto Brackenbury, but Brackenbury was not of the stuff of which murderers are made. Virgil says he feared the consequences to his own reputation and safety, should his complicity in what Moore calls so mean and bestial a deed ever be made public. In Green's presence, he knelt before Our Lady in the Tower, and plainly answered that he would never put the princes to death, though he should die therefore. Believing that his orders would be carried out within a few days, the king rested at Gloucester until the 2nd of August. The Duke of Buckingham was with him. But this would be the last time they saw each other, for before the 2nd of August Richard had managed somehow to alienate Buckingham. What caused this has been a matter for some speculation. Virgil says dissension sprang between the king and the duke because Richard would not grant Buckingham the Bohun inheritance. But Richard had already made a provisional grant of it on the 13th of July, so this cannot have been the reason for Buckingham's sudden disaffection. Moore was probably nearer the truth when he conjectured that although Buckingham had supported Richard's plan to usurp the throne when the king revealed to him at Gloucester that he had been given the order for the killing of the princess, Buckingham realized that things had gone too far and wanted to disassociate himself. There is no other logical reason for his alienation. Only something as cataclysmic as this could have provoked it. Buckingham owed all his vast wealth and political influence to Richard, and if he defected, he would be placing all that, as well as his own life, at risk. Buckingham left the progress at Gloucester, pleading pressing business on his Brecon estates, and the king, suspecting nothing, bade him farewell and rode to Tewkesbury. For some time afterwards he would continue to write to Buckingham as though their alliance was as strong as ever. But, says More, the Duke, on his way home, considered how best to remove this unnatural uncle and bloody butcher from his royal seat and princely dignity. Many revisionists still adhere to the theory that it was Buckingham who murdered the princess. This theory rests on the evidence of 4 slightly later sources. Comines states that the Duke caused the death of the 2 children, and later that he had acted on Richard's orders. The manuscript fragment in the College of Arms says the princes were murdered on the advice of the Duke of Buckingham, and another in Ashmole, MS, 1448.60, dating from 1490, states that Richard III killed his nephews at the prompting of the Duke of Buckingham, it is said. There is no contemporary evidence for the Duke's involvement in the plot to kill the princess. The sources quoted above appear to have reported the gossip then circulating both in England and abroad, gossip which perpetrated many far-fetched theories as to what had happened to Edward V and his brother. Molinet, an untrustworthy source, says that on the day that Edward's sons were assassinated, there came to the Tower of London the Duke of Buckingham, who was believed mistakenly to have murdered the children in order to forward his pretensions to the throne. Molinet states elsewhere that the princes were murdered in late July, but according to Croyland they were alive until the first week in September, and Croyland was in a position to state that as a fact. On the 2nd of August, Buckingham went to Brecon, where he stayed until October. Buckingham alone could not have murdered the princess for several reasons. He was not in the right place at the right time. He had no authority to gain access to them. Brackenbury would not have admitted him to their prison without a royal warrant signed by the king, and if these obstacles had somehow been overcome, Richard III would have speedily found out about it and publicly accused Buckingham in tones of moral outrage of the murder. But Richard did no such thing. Not even later, when Buckingham was charged with other kinds of treason, and it would have been politically advantageous to have laid the deaths of the princess at his door, thus diverting suspicion from Richard himself. This, in itself, is strong evidence that the Duke had no hand in the murder. Even more convincing is Buckingham's own behavior after he left Gloucester. According to More, Buckingham himself later declared to Bishop Morton, "God be my judge, I never agreed or consented to it. Richard arrived at Warwick Castle on the 8th of August. There he received further details of the conspiracies in the south and west, which can only have hardened his resolve to do away with the princess. In the meantime, Queen Anne had arrived with the Earl of Warwick, and she was with Richard when ambassadors from Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain came to propose a marriage between Edward of Middleham and a Spanish infanta. The king remained at Warwick until the 15th of August, when he went to Coventry. Moore states that John Green, returning from the Tower, recounted Brackenbury's refusal to comply with the order to kill the princess to King Richard at Warwick. Richard was annoyed, but his anger was probably superficial, for no open breach occurred with Brackenbury. Not only did Richard know Brackenbury to be an honest man with scruples, qualities that could only reflect upon and benefit the master who had appointed him, but he also could not afford publicly to censure the man or remove him from office because questions would be asked, and Richard did not at that point want public attention focused upon the Tower and its inmates. Before long he had resolved that Brackenbury should be left out of his plans. For the present, however, Richard vented his displeasure, according to Moore, who relished scatological details, whilst sitting on the close stool grumbling to a secret page of his, who was certainly in Richard's confidence, and probably therefore a spy whose function was to assess the loyalties of members of the royal household. "Ah, whom shall a man trust?" sighed the king. "Those that I have brought up myself fail me, and at my commandment will do nothing for me." "Sir," replied his page, "there lieth one on your pallet, without that I dare well say to do your grace pleasure, the thing were right hard that he would refuse." He meant by this Sir James Tyrrell, who says Moore was a man of right goodly personage, and for nature's gifts worthy to have served a much better prince. The man had a high heart, and sore longed upward, not rising yet so fast as he had hoped, which thing this page well had marked and known. Tyrrell had acted as Richard's confident servant for at least 10 years. His family hailed from Gipping in Suffolk, and it has been remarked upon that he bore the same name as Walter Tyrrell, who had supposedly murdered King William Rufus in 1100, though no connection can be traced. James was knighted in 1471, after the Battle of Tewkesbury, and in 1473 had escorted Richard's mother-in-law, the Countess of Warwick, from the sanctuary to Middleham Castle, which proves he had already established himself as trustworthy. Thereafter he served his master well in the west, and in the north as constable of Cardiff Castle, and on campaign in Scotland, where he was made Knight Banneret. In June 1483 he had briefly acted as gaoler to Archbishop Rotherham, and early in Richard III's reign had been appointed master of the king's henchmen. In late July he had travelled on the king's business from London to York, and thence to Warwick, where his duties were to serve Richard as a knight of the body, which was why he was sleeping on a pallet outside the door to the royal bedchamber, his function being to guard his sovereign and guarantee him a peaceful night's sleep. More implies that Tyrrell had hoped for better rewards for his devoted service, but that Ratcliffe and Catesby stood in his way. The page told the king that Tyrrell was so desperate to rise in the world and have his revenge on his rivals that he would agree to do anything, however unpleasant. Richard had apparently been unaware of how desperate Tyrrell was for advancement, and he decided there and then that he would entrust him with arranging the murder of the princess. He rose from the privy, pulled up his breeches, and came out into the pallet chamber, where he found in bed Sir James. The king, calling up Sir James, broke to him secretly his mind in this mischievous matter, in which he found him nothing strange. While Richard plotted with Tyrrell, Buckingham was still travelling to Brecon, which he reached by the middle of August. Virgil says he now deplored his failure to resist King Richard's evil enterprise. At Brecknock Castle, his prisoner John Morton, Bishop of Ely, awaited him. Morton loathed Richard III, and regarded him as a usurper who should be eliminated without scruple. He had made no secret of his views, and it was therefore natural that Buckingham should confide in him. More's book ends with an account of the conversations between Morton and Buckingham, which may have come direct from Morton himself, as no other source gives similar details. The Duke told Morton that after hearing of the king's resolve to murder the princes, he abhorred the sight and much more the company of Richard. More, says Buckingham, told Morton he was considering pressing his own claim to the throne, and that Morton told him he had excellent virtues, meet for the rule of the realm. Unfortunately, More's unfinished narrative ends at this point. Morton was a shrewd man, and his political instincts were sound. He must have been appalled to learn that Richard had ordered the murder of the princess, and probably predicted that the usurper would not reign for long after the deed was done. It is likely that he warned Buckingham of what would happen to him if Richard's enemies succeeded in deposing him. None as yet knew of Buckingham's disaffection, and he would be dealt with as befitted the tyrant's chief supporter. More states that Buckingham's conversation with Morton was what persuaded him actively to rebel against the king. It is clear from the attainder, later passed on Buckingham, that this was to be a separate conspiracy from those in the south and west. One led by Buckingham and the clever Morton, whose situation was already precarious, and who was later attainted with the Duke for plotting treason. Buckingham is said by the Tudor chronicler Edward Hall to have not long afterwards met Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond, by virtue of her first marriage to Edmund Tudor, and now the wife of Lord Stanley, on the road between Bridgenorth and Worcester. She, thinking Buckingham to be still close to the king, begged him to intercede with Richard on behalf of her son, Henry Tudor, an exile in Brittany for many years, telling the Duke she longed to have him home. Henry Tudor was the Lancastrian claimant to the throne, but he was virtually unknown in England, and few people took him seriously except for his mother, who the evidence suggests that had been involved in the conspiracies against the king. Buckingham may have suspected or known as much and realized that here was a potential ally. He told the Countess what was in his mind, and confided that he was considering making a bid for the crown himself. But she, with great firmness, reminded him that both she and her son stood as both bulwark and portcullis between him and the throne. Only if he supported Henry Tudor's claim would she lend him her support. Buckingham, whose chief motive in rebelling was probably self-preparation, and who had probably always been a Lancastrian at heart, began then to consider abandoning his regal pretensions and offering his allegiance to Henry Tudor instead. The Countess, he knew, would be a valuable ally. Margaret Beaufort was a fervent Lancastrian. For all her small stature, she was a formidable woman, highly intelligent, literate, strong-minded, devout, and austere in her religious observances. She was the sole heiress of the Beaufort descendants of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. In 1455, at the age of 12, she had been given in marriage by Henry IV to Edmund Tudor. He was one of the sons of Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V, and her Welsh clerk of the wardrobe, Owen Tudor, who may have been her husband, although there is no evidence to prove it. In 1452, however, Parliament had declared Edmund and his brother Jasper legitimate, and Henry VI had created them Earls of Richmond and Pembroke respectively. Edmund's marriage to Margaret Beaufort was highly advantageous to him, but in 1456 he was captured and imprisoned by the Yorkists in Carmarthen Castle, where he died later that year. 12 weeks later, in January 1457, his widow, aged only 13, bore a son, Henry Tudor, at Pembroke Castle. He was to be her only child, her own sweet and most dear son, and would all his life excite in her the deepest maternal sentiments and ambitions. Henry was Earl of Richmond from his birth. His early years were spent at Pembroke in the care of his mother and his uncle Jasper. Between 1459 and 1464, Margaret married the Lancastrian Sir Henry Stafford, who later switched his allegiance to Edward IV, thus allying his staunchy Lancastrian wife with her enemies. In 1461, Jasper fought for the Lancastrians against Edward, and when the latter became king, the year Jasper was forced to flee abroad. The new king made Henry the ward of Lord Herbert, a loyal Yorkist, to whom had been granted the ownership of Pembroke Castle, and in whose custody the boy spent his formative years. King Edward undoubtedly hoped that being brought up in a good Yorkist family would preclude Henry from having any ideas about pressing his somewhat tenuous claim to the throne or developing strong Lancastrian sympathies. Certainly he did not see his mother after 1461, and before 1462 he was deprived of the earldom of Richmond, which was given to Clarence. During the brief restoration of Henry IV in 1470 to 1471, Jasper Tudor returned from exile and presented his nephew at court, on which occasion Henry IV Henry VI. Let's start at the top of that paragraph again. During the brief restoration of Henry VI in 1470 to 1471, Jasper Tudor returned from exile and presented his nephew at court, on which occasion Henry VI is said to have predicted that Henry Tudor was he unto whom both we and our adversaries must yield and give over the dominion. Henry and Jasper then returned to Wales. After the deaths of Henry VI and his son, the House of Lancaster's claim to the throne became vested in Henry Tudor, the only viable claimant. However, he was only 14 at the time, unknown and penniless, and since he was unlikely to be more than an irritation to Edward IV for some years to come, few took him seriously as a pretender. The king, nevertheless, would dearly have loved to get his hands on him, and therefore Henry and Jasper were obliged to flee in 1471 to Brittany, where they remained for the next 13 years. Francis II, Duke of Brittany, offered them a refuge, refusing to surrender them to Edward IV, despite the latter's demands, but promising instead not to let them leave the duchy. In the end, Edward was paying Francis II to keep them there, and Henry chafed against his lack of freedom, complaining to Comines that since the age of 5 he had been guarded like a fugitive and kept in prison, though Comines adds that Duke Francis treated him reasonably well. Margaret Beaufort, meanwhile, had married a third husband, Lord Stanley, a prominent Yorkist, and had become a frequent visitor to the court of Edward IV. Before the king died, she had almost managed to persuade him to agree to a reconciliation with her son, which indicates that Edward no longer considered Henry a serious political threat. But the king's death put an end to the countess's hopes. At least now, Henry was allowed more freedom by Duke Francis, even if he was desperately short of money. From 1471 onwards, the only people who supported Henry Tudor's claim to the throne were his mother, his immediate kinsmen, and his friends in exile, of whom the most prominent was Jasper Tudor and the Earl of Oxford. Henry's claim derived from his mother, to whom he always deferred as the lawful heiress to the House of Lancaster. There was nothing in law to prevent Margaret Beaufort from claiming the crown herself, but in the political climate of the late 15th century, she would have found very few supporters because of her sex. However, the crown had passed by descent through a woman on several occasions. King Stephen, Henry II, and the Yorkist kings were notable examples of monarchs whose claims to the throne came via a female line. There were, in fact, descendants of the House of Lancaster with a better claim to the throne than Henry Tudor, namely the King of Portugal and the Queen of Castile, both descended from John of Gaunt by the lawfully born daughters of his first and second wives. The Beaufort descendants of Gaunt, as we have seen, were barred from the succession, although it was widely felt that this had no basis in law. In any case, the House of York had by far the best claim to the throne. On the face of it, Henry Tudor's prospects of wearing a crown seemed quite remote. Richard III was not to begin troubled by Henry Tudor's pretensions. He was still on progress, and had travelled from Coventry via Lancaster, Nottingham, and Doncaster to Pontefract Castle, which he reached on the 27th of August. Here he was greeted by his small son Edward, who had been created Prince of Wales the day before, and had just travelled over by chariot from Middleham. It was probably at Pontefract that Richard issued orders for the appointment of commissioners to deal with those arrested in connection with the conspiracies to restore Edward V. Crowds were out in force to see the king and queen make their ceremonial entry into York on the 30th of August. This was not entirely spontaneous, because a week beforehand the king's secretary, John Kendall, had sent, on Richard's command, a letter to the city fathers commanding them to receive His Highness and the Queen as laudably as your wisdom can imagine. They should be worshipfully received with pageants and other celebrations. Guaranteed crowd pullers, many southern lords and men of worship are with them, and will greatly remark you receiving their graces. The civic authorities had risen magnificently to the occasion, determined to impress the Southerners, and Kendall's assurance that the king intended to have his lords and judges in every place sitting, determining the complaints of poor folks with due punishment of offenders against his laws, brought many hopeful people to the streets to see the king welcomed by the mayor and aldermen outside the Micklegate bar, and entertained inside the city walls with 3 spectacular pageants. If Richard was popular anywhere, it was in York, and there were cheers for him that day. Shortly afterwards, Thomas Langton, who had the king to thank for his promotion to see to St. David's, and would soon receive and even richer see that of Salisbury when Lionel Woodville fled into exile, wrote of Richard. He wrote, "He contents the people where he goes best that ever did prince, for many a poor man that hath suffered wrong many days have been relieved and helped by him and his commands in his progress. And in many great cities and towns were great sums of money given him, which he hath refused. On my truth, I liked never the conditions of any prince so well as his. God hath sent him to us for the weal of us all." For all the sycophancy implicit in this letter, it is clear that Richard was doing his best to win the support and approval of his subjects by demonstrating his resolve to restore law and order and firm government to the benefit of even the poorest members of society. A cynic might say that this was an overt bid for popularity and was ultimately for Richard's benefit, but it was also a placatory and conciliatory measure meant to restore the public's confidence in him. Yet at the same time the king had other darker deeds on his mind. Moore states that on or before the 15th of August, 1483, Richard III dispatched Tyrrell from Warwick to Brackenbury. Virgil, however, implies that Tyrrell was actually sent from York, and the wardrobe accounts corroborate this with evidence that Sir James left York for London on the 30th and 31st August 1483, with orders to collect robes and hall hangings for use at the investiture of the Prince of Wales. due to be held on York on the 8th in York on the 8th of September. These accounts also show that Tyrrell obtained cloth for himself and the king's henchmen at this time. This provided perfect cover for Tyrrell's more important business in London. Back in June, Richard Radcliffe, on urgent business, had ridden from London to York in 4 days. Tyrrell, who needed to be back by the 8th of September for the investiture, probably took the same length of time, arriving in London around the 3rd of September. Moore portrays Tyrrell as keen to carry out his sovereign's orders, but Virgil says he felt he had been forced to do the king's commandment, and rode sorrowfully to London very unwillingly. Maybe Tyrrell, desperate for promotion, was now wishing it could have been achieved through any task other than this. It is perhaps significant that he would not be in the room when the murder was carried out. With Tyrrell rode a man whom Moore describes as Sir James, own horsekeeper, a big, broad, square, strong knave called John Dighton. As a groom, he may well have known John Green, who helped look after the royal horses. All we know of his background is that he may have been the John Dighton who was bailiff of the manor of Ayton in North Yorkshire, which was owned by the Earl of Northumberland, Richard's ally. Moore states that Tyrrell carried a letter from the king to Brackenbury, by which he was commanded to deliver Sir James all the keys of the Tower for one night, to the end he might there accomplish the king's pleasure. It is probable that Richard's mandate was worded in such a way as to absolve Brackenbury from all responsibility in the matter. Giving up the keys of the Tower to Tyrrell did not in itself constitute a mortal sin. Brackenbury may have accepted that it was necessary for the princess to be eliminated, though he did not want to be the man to do it. Or he may have believed the night had come to take the princess away, either abroad or into hiding in England, to foil any future conspiracies. On the other hand, the mandate might equally well have contained a warning to Brackenbury not to oppose his sovereign's wishes. Brackenbury had now had leisure to ponder his earlier refusal, knowing whence he had derived his good fortune, and his loyalty to Richard III was never thereafter in doubt. The fact that he had had to be so delicately cozened in the matter is proof that no one without a warrant from the king would have been able to gain access to the princes. Croyland states authoritatively that the princes remained in the Tower while the coronation, the royal progress, and the investiture of Prince Edward on the 8th of September were taking place. After that he does not say what happened to them, and his silence is most eloquent, for a man in his position must have known or guessed something about their fate. In fact, the princes must have been murdered before the 8th of September, for Tyrrell would have had to leave London on the 4th of September at the latest to get the wardrobe materials back to York in time for the investiture. If he left York on the 30th of August, and the journey took 4 days, the likeliest date he was in London was the 3rd September, and that was the night on which the murders almost certainly took place. Moore's account of the killing of the princess is unique No other writer offers as much detail, and it is its very detail that argues its authenticity. It is true that Moore asserted that the killings took place on the 15th of August, but this could have been due to the faulty memories of those who gave him his information. While people remember events with clarity, they often have trouble recalling dates accurately. Moore says that after the king's letter had been handed by Tyrrell to Brackenbury at the Tower, and the keys received, Sir James appointed the night next ensuing, i.e., that night, to destroy the princess, devising before and preparing the means. The plan was that they should be murdered in their beds, to the execution whereof he appointed Miles Forrest and John Dighton. Next he removed the princess, 3 other attendants, including William Slaughter, of whom no more is recorded. It may be that these men were dismissed on the pretext that the princes were being removed elsewhere. Slaughter, in any case, may have become too attached to his charges. It is significant that of the 4 attendants, only Forrest was chosen to assist in the murder, and it may have been he who warned Tyrrell that Slaughter was not to be trusted. At midnight that night, the silly, i.e., innocent, children lying in their beds, Tyrrell positioned himself outside their bedchamber, while Forrest and Dighton came into the chamber and suddenly lapped them up among the clothes, so bewrapped them and entangled them, keeping down by force the feather bed and pillows hard into their mouths, that within a while, smothered and stifled, their breath failing, they gave up to God their innocent souls into the joys of heaven, leaving to the tormentors their bodies dead in the bed, which after that the wretches perceived first by the struggling with the pains of death, and after long lying still to be thoroughly dead, they laid their bodies naked out upon the bed. An authentic detail, for most people slept naked, and fetched Sir James to see them. This traitorous death, concluded Moore, delivered them from their wretchedness. Virgil records none of these details, despite in his intensive research he had to admit that although he knew that Tyrrell murdered those babes, with what kind of death these children were executed is not certainly known. Of course, he had not had access to Moore's sources. He did, however, point out that Tyrrell could, that night, without danger to his life, have spared the boys, rescued them from death, and carried them to safety. For without doubt all the people would have risen in arms to save them. But Tyrrell had done no such thing. He wanted preferment without further risk to himself. John Roos states it was afterwards known to very few by what manner of death the princess had suffered, and other writers gave different versions of the murders, which doubtless derived from rumor. Andre says the princess were put to the sword, while the Song of the Lady Bessie alleges they were drowned in wine, echoing a rumor recorded in the Great Chronicle of London for the year 1484, when people were surmising that the boys suffered the same fate as their Uncle Clarence. Molinet says they were walled up in a chamber in the Tower and left to starve to death. Finally, John Ratzel, Moore's brother-in-law, writing in the Pastime of People, published in 1529, gives 2 versions of the prince's fate. Firstly, he says that a grave was dug, and the children, in response to a cry of treason, were coerced into a large chest, in which they were buried alive. Here Rastel appears to be reporting a rumor which may have been circulating for more than 40 years, while his second version of what might have happened is drawn in part from Moore's Richard III, with added detail, again probably derived from popular rumors for dramatic effect. Here is the quote. But of the manner of death of his young king and his brother there were divers opinions, but the most common opinion was that they were smothered between two feather beds, and that in doing the young brother escaped from under the feather beds, and crept under the bedstead, and there lay naked, while till that they had smothered the young king, so that he was surely dead. And after that one of them took his brother from under the bedstead, and held his face down to the ground with his one hand, and with the other hand cut his throat whole with a dagger. After the murder, Moore says, Tyrrell, upon the sight of the bodies, caused those murderers to bury them at the stair-foot, meetly deep under the ground, under a great heap of stones. Dighton, a strong, brawny man, would have been capable of this heavy work, and we may assume that Forrest was similarly strong and tough. Forensic evidence, which will be discussed in depth later on, confirms Moore's account of the prince's burial. Rastel, however, says their bodies were put in a chest and loaded on a ship bound for Flanders. When the ship reached the black deeps at the mouth of the Thames, the chest was thrown into the sea. Rastel thought this story must have been true because the bones of the said children could never be found buried, neither in the Tower nor in none other place. With the princess murdered and buried in the space of one night, Tyrrell relinquished the Tower keys to Brackenbury, and rode to York, where he saw the king, who gave him thanks, and some say made him a knight. In fact, Tyrrell had been knighted in 1471. What Richard did by way of reward was to ensure Tyrrell's rise to prominence by appointing him to a succession of lucrative offices over the next 2 years, thus guaranteeing that he would enjoy the status at court he had so avidly sought. Tyrrell also amassed considerable wealth, so that his annual income rapidly became equal to that of some barons. In 1483 he became master of the king's horse, and between November 1483 and April 1484 was given prominent post formerly occupied by convicted traitors, whose estates he was commissioned to administer. He received a number of stewardships, and was made Sheriff of Wenlock in 1484, and Chamberlain of the Exchequer. In 1485 he was sent on a secret mission concerning the king's weal to Flanders, and then appointed captain of Gisnes Castle, which guarded the Pale of Calais, and last English possession remaining in France. As for those others who assisted Tyrrell with their murder of the princes, Forrest and Green both received grants from the king late in 1483, and Green was appointed to several offices: receiver of the Isle of Wight, and overseer of the port of Southampton on the 14th December 1483. and Eschator of Southampton in December 1484. On 20th September 1483, he was granted a general pardon for all offenses by the king, and in order to avoid questions being asked about his activities, his neighbors in Warwickshire were all granted one too. Such pardons were not unusual during the aftermath of conspiracies. Forrest was rewarded with a post at Baynard's Castle, but did not fare so well. It seems he was overcome by the enormity of what he had done for. Says Moore, he sought sanctuary at St. Martin le Grand in London, where he piecemeal rotted away, and died before September 1484, when the king granted his widow a pension of 5 marks, which was quite usual in such cases. As for Dighton, he was given a pension, but seems to have taken to a life of crime, of which we shall hear more in due course. Slaughter, perhaps tellingly, received no reward. Brackenbury was rewarded by the king for his cooperation, being given several grants and appointments later that year, some of which were lucrative offices once occupied by Hastings. The constable was also granted some of the fortified estates of Lord Rivers and others. More and other later writers all claimed that the princes' bodies were afterwards dug up and reburied. There is no evidence to support the allegations made by Rastell Hall, Grafton. More and other later writers all claim that the princesses' bodies were afterwards dug up and reburied. There is no evidence to support the allegations made by Rastell Hall, Grafton, and Harding that they were reburied at sea in the Black Deeps. Grafton and Hall say the King Richard ordered one man, a priest, to disinter the chest from its burial place under several feet of rubble, remove the corpses, and place them in a lead coffin punctured with many holes, and cast them into the sea. The priest is supposed to have died soon afterwards, and disclosed it never to any person that would utter it. But then how did the chroniclers know of it? In any case, it is hardly likely that a solitary priest could have successfully undertaken such a task. Moore, whose sources were much sounder, states that Richard III, after learning how the princes' bodies had been disposed of, allowed not, as I have heard, the burying in so vile a corner, saying that he would have them buried in a better place, because they were a king's sons. Lo, murder with a solemn obloquy. Whereupon they say that a priest of Sir Robert Brackenbury took up the bodies again, and secretly interred them in such place as by the occasion of his death, which only knew it could never since have come to life. Once again, we have a tale of a solitary priest disintering bodies that had been buried deep under rubble by 2 brawny men, though of course he may have had help from Brackenbury, who employed him. It is characteristic of Richard III that he should contemplate the reburial of his nephews. As a youth, he had witnessed the reinterment at Fotheringhay of his father and brother Edmund, and in 1484 he himself ordered the reburial of Henry VI, whose bones were moved from Chertsey to Windsor. It was therefore plausible that he had ordered the reburial of the princes, but it is unlikely in view of the forensic evidence discovered 2 centuries later in the Tower. What is possible is that one of More's sources deliberately gave him the wrong information in order to avoid a search being made for the bodies and the uncovering of incriminating evidence. Or More may have simply reported that what people had supposed had taken place in view of the fact that no bodies had been found up to that time despite several searches. It may even be that Richard III ordered a priest to perform obsequies over the grave, and that More and others assumed, in a view of the mystery surrounding the bodies' whereabouts, that he had also ordered the prince's reburial. From Richard III's point of view, if it was necessary that the princes should die, it was also necessary that people should know they were dead, in order to put an end to speculation and confound those who might plot to restore Edward V. According to Virgil, King Richard kept the slaughter not long secret, who within few days after permitted the rumour of their deaths to go abroad, to the intent that after the people understood no male issue of King Edward to be now left alive, they might with better mind and good will bear to sustain his government. It is unlikely that these rumours spoke of the princess being murdered, just that they had died, as it was widely accepted by the beginning of October that they lived no more, and the rumours would have had to be in circulation for at least a fortnight to be this effective. It is quite likely that it was indeed Richard himself who instigated them. When on the 8th of September he walked hand in hand with his son and his wife into York Minster for young Edward's investiture as Prince of Wales, the king did so in the belief that he had removed the last dynastic threat to his throne and put an end once and for all to the conspiracies that had overshadowed his reign.